Hello, gentlemen. This is C.S. MGTOW. What we are now seeing creep into the mainstream of popular science is a set of beliefs about the genders that is often unsupported by the available evidence, and in many situations actually contradicted by evidence and real-life observations when one studies both men and women closely. These scientists and academics take factual differences based on, let's say, the brains of men and women, point to real, structural, or biochemical differences, and then make a statement as to the impact of this difference in relation to the abilities of each gender, even when this supposed ability rarely manifests itself in the gender in question. It's a symptom of the popular mainstream narrative about the supposed superiority of the human female and attempts to explain these supposedly superior traits biologically. We are in an age, it seems, that inaccurate observations about males and females can be made without challenge as long as they serve to flatter the sensibilities of women. So today, I am going to be critiquing a video by a well-known academic and feminist known as Helen Fisher. Helen holds a PhD. She is a biological anthropologist and human behavior researcher. She took part in a discussion at the University of South Florida, and she is, in my mind, the worst kind of academic in that she is able to, behind her standing as a respected professor, pass off the worst forms of gender bigotry and biological determinism as legitimate science. As a woman, her opinion is deemed to be beyond reproach by a society that has grown too lazy to care, no matter how outlandish her statements. It is based on such credibility that she and her ideologically driven but credentialed ilk lend a veneer of legitimacy to the worst forms of legalized and social discrimination against men. So without further ado, let's delve into her recent lecture at the University of South Florida College of Arts and Science.
Thanks for being here. You got your clicker, you got your water.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to start out with the theme for the evening. It's much larger than these particular pictures, but this is the theme, and you'll get the point. It's an issue about a gender difference in intimacy. Women tend to get intimacy from face-to-face talking. We swivel until we're face-to-face. We focus on each other. It's called the anchoring gaze, and we talk. It probably comes from millions of years of holding that baby in front of your face, cajoling it, reprimanding it, educating it with words. Intimacy is talking for women. Men tend to get intimacy from side-by-side doing. As soon as he looks up, he'll look away. It's like a Sunday football team, it's a football game when they're sitting next to each other for hours, never saying really anything, and get a great deal of intimacy out of it. The problem, of course, is this. The sexes don't really understand each other. So I want to start out by talking about gender differences in the brain and then move on to these two other personality styles. And remember forever, please, that we're a mix of all of them. People who are very expressive of the oxytocin and estrogen system tend to do what I call web thinking. I think of all of the gender differences, the most important and most stunning to me is how men and women think. Plato once said, when the mind is thinking, it's talking to itself. Indeed, we're always accumulating information and assembling it into patterns and relationships. We've got a committee meeting going on in our head as we're thinking. But psychologists report that when women think, they gather more data, they integrate these details faster, and they put the data into more complex patterns. When they make decisions, they weigh more variables, consider more outcomes, and see more ways to proceed. Women tend to generalize, they synthesize, they take a more holistic, contextual perspective than most men.
Okay, and here we have my very, very first area of concern. While this all makes women seem absolutely wonderful, Helen has made a grave error. And that error is the failure to connect real-life data and verify if this data matches up with her beliefs about the implications of the female sex, relying on the hormone oxytocin. Helen, like many other journalistic-style academics who have come before her, rely on ideology. Research suggests that what we know about oxytocin is actually incomplete, and according to the prestigious journal Nature, as researchers work out how oxytocin affects the brain, the hormone is actually shedding its reputation as a simple cuddle chemical. Oxytocin has been of keen interest to neuroscientists since the 1970s, when studies started to show that it could drive maternal behavior and social attachment in various species. Its involvement in a range of social behaviors, including monogamy in voles, mother-infant bonding in sheep, and even trust between humans, has earned it a reputation as a hug hormone. People just concluded it was a bonding molecule, a cuddling hormone, and that's the pervasive view in the popular press, says Larry Young, a neuroscientist at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, who has been studying the molecule since the 1990s. You see, that particular view led some clinicians to try oxytocin as a treatment for a range of psychiatric conditions, including autism spectrum disorder. But the early clinical trials actually had mixed results, and scientists are now seeking a deeper understanding of how oxytocin works in the brain. So, just before we go on here, gentlemen, do you see what legitimate science looks like? The scientific community found an interesting hormone that at the time was believed to be associated with bonding. Clinicians tried to then develop oxytocin as a treatment for psychiatric conditions. When this failed, it was clear that what was believed about this hormone was either incorrect or incomplete, and the scientific community quickly abandoned this hypothesis. This is the scientific method. Unfortunately, members of the scientific community who are also feminists, such as Helen, refuse to now acknowledge what is known about oxytocin. You see, recent work has pointed out to a potentially dark side to oxytocin. Sue Carter is a neuroscientist at Indiana University in Bloomington, whose lab actually pioneered many of the early studies in oxytocin in voles. Her group recently found that a single low dose of the hormone given to baby voles improved their pair bonding, but that higher doses interfered with that behavior, possibly because oxytocin started to activate other receptors. And human studies have suggested that in certain contexts, a puff of oxytocin can cause people to become more aggressive in defending themselves against outsiders or competitors. In patients with a psychiatric condition known as borderline personality disorder, a single dose of oxytocin has been found to hinder trust and cooperation. In an article published in the journal Social Psychology and Personality Science by Nathan DeWall and colleagues titled "When the Love Hormone Leads to Violence," oxytocin increases intimate partner violence inclinations among high-trait aggressive people. The authors concluded that among highly aggressive people, a boost of oxytocin may cause them to use aggression towards close others as a means of maintaining their relationship. And the authors then said, adopting an interactionist approach, we predicted that oxytocin would increase intimate partner violent inclinations, but this effect would be limited to people high in trait physical aggression. So these authors carried out a double-blind, placebo-controlled between-subject experiment. And this really is the gold standard of scientific experiments. And participants varying in trait physical aggression received either 24 international units of oxytocin or a placebo. And then following 2 provocation tasks, participants rated the probability that they would engage in various aggressive behaviors, for example, slapping or throwing an object that could hurt towards a romantic partner. And what they found was that oxytocin absolutely increased intimate partner violence inclinations, but this effect was, of course, limited to participants already prone to physical aggression. And these data actually offer the first evidence that intimate partner violence inclinations may have some form of biological basis in a combination of oxytocin and trait physical aggressiveness, according to the authors. So research suggests that oxytocin actually increases inclinations towards intimate partner violence in certain groups, and that actually explains a lot. And why I say this will become more apparent as we focus on a very, very interesting piece of research published by Catherine Sokum Tang, and that particular paper is titled Frequency of Parental Violence Against Children in Chinese Families, Impact of Age and Gender. So the abstract of this paper tells, fortunately, all too familiar story. And the authors basically said, the present study examines the impact of child and parent gender on parental violence across age span of children and their parents in Hong Kong families. A randomly selected community of 1,019 households was surveyed. Results indicate that, in general, boys experience more frequent parental violence than girls. Surprise, surprise. Mothers engage in more violent behaviors against their children than fathers. Again, surprise, surprise. And then the authors went on to say in the abstract, there is a pattern of declining frequency of parental violence as parental age increases across child gender. So fathers exhibited an inverted U pattern of parental violence against their children, with a peak age of the parents around 31 to 40, while mothers have a steadily declining trend up to age 46. So women will hit more often, and they'll hit far longer. So what this author is basically concluding, and again, this isn't particularly groundbreaking, this has been covered by study after study after study. In the real world, women are actually far more violent. They tend to, of course, engage in violence within social situations where they can face very, very little or zero repercussions, and that often is within the safety of their own homes. Women are simply too risk-adverse as a gender to initiate violence when there's a chance of being on the receiving end of reciprocal violence by an adult. Evidence shows that they are absolutely more than willing to hit those unable to defend themselves, either due to their size or limited legal protections. For this reason, women will be far more likely to violently assault the young or to assault their partner behind closed doors. Oxytocin is most certainly an important hormone for human connection, but it actually does seem that past experience and interpersonal predispositions complicates oxytocin's social bonding capabilities, or its kind of role. So within women who are already prone to violence, this hormone increases quite substantially the possibility of interpersonal violence by such women. And that really is, of course, contrary to the idea being pushed by Helen that it's a cuddle hormone. So I really, really hope, and I know that bit was long-winded, that you now see just how shallow Helen's analysis is. Just before we continue, I think it's important here to just point out that one mustn't interpret Helen's nonsense about women being more nurturing as simply a bit of benign female posturing. This ideology is used to justify the madness of the tender years doctrine, things such as reduced sentencing for women in the cases of sexual or violent crimes up to and including murder, and women being awarded as primary caregivers routinely in the family courts. After all, well, because they're more nurturing, right? The gynocentrisms that precede this belief are, of course, shaped by evolutionary pressures. However, the mind state that supports these discriminatory structures in this day and age is absolutely based on the kind of pop journalistic science, the kind of science used by Helen to support her bigotry.
Men tend to focus. They pay attention to one thing at a time. They compartmentalize the brain. And they tend to get rid of any kind of extraneous data and proceed in a more linear causal forward pathway, what I call step thinking. There's a great many examples of this. I will give you only one, and this is all I'm going to say about sex. I'll start off with another. When you ask a man or a woman to describe their business, a man will view the company as a set of tasks or machines or jobs or payments. Woman tends to see an organization as an integrated, multi-layered whole comprised of patterns of relationships. Women screenwriters write much more complex narratives with multiple endings. Sometimes you can't even figure out what the ending is. Men's plots are much more linear, much more goal-oriented.
Here Helen makes a factual point. However, my concern with Helen here lies in her conclusions of the scattiness of women and their inability to focus. And in her own words, women screenwriters write much more complex narratives with multiple endings. Sometimes one cannot even figure out what the ending is. This inability to actually focus on the task at hand and deliver a cogent, well-thought-out script for a screen might explain why there are so few female screenwriters. But the current narrative is that this is a result of a nefarious conspiracy on the part of men to hold back these wonderful, talented screenwriters who can't put together an enjoyable story. An article in The Telegraph actually blames this squarely on gender inequality. Apparently, women accounted for just 11% of writers working on the top 250 films in 2014, and that 70% of films had no female writers at all. Now, Helen attempts to suggest that the ability of men in understanding a plot and putting a good script around it so that a director can turn this into a commercially viable piece of work is actually something that is not as valuable as the overall inability of women to focus on and deliver a quality product. Thankfully, the free market still seems to be above the feminist message, and any film hiring such a female screenwriter who's unable to write a believable plot will quickly face bankruptcy.
Robert Frost once said, all thought is a feat of association. We now know where this gender difference in web thinking and step thinking is. This is the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain with which we assemble data and put it into parts, where we do our sequential thinking, where we do our web thinking. And indeed, they've now found one gene, and they're going to find a lot of other genes, that are linked with web thinking. And this particular gene is silenced in all men and active in 50% of women. We also know that the two hemispheres are better connected in women. The factories in the back of the brain are better connected to long-distance factories in women. The male brain is more compartmentalized. It's built that way in the womb. Men are just as good at thinking as women. They think somewhat differently. In fact, there's many more male geniuses in the world, and there's many more male idiots in the world. Women have a sturdier mind.
Again, here we begin to see Helen's ideology creep straight back in. Helen contradicts herself twice within the space of about 30 seconds. Firstly, she says that men are just as good as thinking as women. This, of course, indicates, or should indicate from her point of view, that the female mind is the default against which male brains are to be measured against. Then she goes on to correctly state that there are many more male geniuses, and then she states that women's minds are sturdier than men's. Well, how can all of these statements be compatible? At least two are mutually exclusive. Her last statement not only contradicts her own research, but actually is contradicted by numerous areas of scientific inquiry into gender differences in creativity and output. You see, if women's minds are so much sturdier than men's, why have women contributed so little to the development of our civilization outside of reproduction? Outside of being semen receptacles and consumers of the fine and pretty, why have so few of the inventions that we gaze at and wonder come from the supposedly sturdier minds of women? According to a Harvard Business Review special report led by economist Sylvia Ann Hewlett, 41% of highly qualified scientists, engineers, and technologies on the lower rungs of the corporate ladders are female, yet more than 54% of them drop out between their mid to late 30s. And although women account for 28% of people entering surgical training, they are at least twice as likely to leave the programs compared to men, either for their own reasons or because they were terminated. Again, this belief that women's intellect is somehow sturdier and that women are the default to be measured against intellectually forms the basis for the legalized discrimination of better qualified men through a myriad of affirmative action programs that have handed undeserved jobs and academic opportunities to women at the expense of men. Because despite the evidence that suggests that women innovate less, they hold less patents, that they are less able to succeed within the STEM fields, that they drop out at greater rates, Helen and her ilk will insist that any differences are not due to differences in ability, but due to systemic gender discrimination. After all, according to her logic, the brains of women are hardwired in just the right way to make them superior beings. Now, one of the things that I would like to really focus on here is when women tend to drop out. You see, to get to the lower rungs of the corporate ladder or medicine, for all intents and purposes, requires memorization and rote learning. Medical school requires that you simply remember a vast amount of information, and to become a junior corporate manager requires a pretty routine set of qualifications. The next step up, where either one becomes a senior corporate leader or captain of industry or a trained surgeon, actually requires real-life ability, the qualities which school does very little to prepare one for, the ability to improvise and creatively find solutions to problems. And it's at these very stages that women drop out for the much easier social role of motherhood, or they go off to find themselves by working for an NGO or charity, or become food and fashion bloggers, leaving the difficult work to men.
In fact, that has left women with a very special characteristic, which is their imagination. In fact,
Okay, here we have another assertion not backed up by the real-life data. According to the article titled "The Reporting Gap on the Gender Pay Gap" by Karen Frankel, and this has been covered in one of Barbarossa's videos as well, apparently just 7.5% of patent holders are women, and just 5.5% of those holding commercialized patents are women. If their imaginations are so excellent, then why do they innovate less in the real world? If by, imagination you mean time wasted on matching shoes with outfits, ensuring that curtains, complement the texture of the bedroom rug. Sure, women are the most imaginative creatures on the face of the planet, Helen, but if you're talking about the kind of imagination that helps propel our species forward, then women have contributed relatively little to date. In fact, the author Karen Frankel also questions whether the growing number of women obtaining advanced degrees translates directly into more women receiving patents on their work. And I'm going to quote Karen here. She said, "It doesn't seem to be the case that the growth of women in receiving advanced degrees is turning into innovation."
they've got there's a lot of things that stem from this. One is women are able to tolerate ambiguity better. They're better at intuition. We now know what intuition is. It comes from a Nobel laureate called Herb Simon. It's called chunking. And what chunking is as a person analyzes the stock market, learns about the history of Europe, tracks a political issue, you begin to recognize patterns. And then you see regularities in those patterns. And then you organize these patterns into blocks of knowledge known as chunking. And then with time, more patterns are chunked, and these clusters of knowledge are stored in long-term memory. And then, when you see a tiny little detail of the much larger pattern, boom, you see the entire pattern more rapidly than somebody who's doing step-by-step sequential thought. And in fact, women seem to be better at this, most likely, I think, because they have so many connections in different parts of the brain.
Okay, well, that's a very bold claim. So Helen suggests that women, by means of their intuition, or as she describes it, chunking, are better able to spot patterns and make sense of incredibly abstract patterns. Let's measure this against real-life performance. So on screen, I've posted a link to an article titled "A Dozen Things I've Learned from Michael Moritz About Venture Capital," in which the author of a well-known financial and tech blog, 25IQ, discusses the key skills needed to be an excellent venture capitalist. And here's what the author said. pattern recognition is an essential skill in venture capital. So I literally found hundreds of such articles with a very, very simple Google search about, what do you need to be successful as a venture capitalist? And another article was, a dozen things I've learned about venture capital in 999 words by Trent Griffin. And again, the author concluded that having great pattern recognition skills is critical in venture capital. So supposedly women excel at pattern recognition. Then why did the largest study of its kind by Harvard academics point out the indisputable facts that women venture capitalists underperform men? Women venture capitalists apparently underperform their male counterparts by some 15% according to the Harvard University study. And it's just a quote by the authors. They said, "We found that female venture capitalists significantly underperform their male colleagues," wrote Paul Gumpers and his colleagues in their study titled Gender Effects in Venture Capital. And surprise, surprise, the authors blamed the performance difference in part on the lack of mentoring by male colleagues. So look, what's the actual narrative here? Women are better at pattern recognition, but need help from their supposedly male inferiors to be able to do jobs that they're supposedly better suited for naturally? Or should we face the truth that women are inferior at recognizing complex patterns when it matters? When billions of dollars are on the line, they underperform to the tune of 15% on average versus their male counterparts. And the authors in that same article made two rather illuminating statements based on their observations and based on the real life data. And the first of which was that investments made by females are percentage-wise less likely to go public, and women outperformers in their studies usually credit a male colleague who took them under his wing. That should tell us a lot.
They tend to do much more long-term planning than men do.
Oh, really, Helen? Women tend to do much more long-term planning than men? Well, perhaps Helen can explain these two studies. The first looked into retirement savings patterns, which is, of course, one of the most important long-term planning preparations an individual can engage in. Asset management firm BlackRock's Global Investor Plus survey of 27,000 investors worldwide, including 4,000 Americans, found that 53% of working-age American women have started saving for retirement compared with 65% of men. Furthermore, American women aged between 55 to 64 with retirement savings have accumulated an average of $81,300 compared to $118,400 for their male counterparts, the survey reveals. And a 2015 analysis of retirement readiness by the Employee Benefit Research Institute also found that single females on the verge of retirement, that is, the early baby boomers, have a savings shortfall of nearly $63,000, while the single males of the same age group have a deficit of $34,000. So males have far more money than they need when they're single going into retirement. MGTOW, this is really, really music to my ears. If you stay single, you're going to have a far better retirement as a result. At least that's what I interpret according to this data. And the second article of note here was put together by the Insurance Information Institute, and they concluded in 2015 that women now comprise 57% of the US labor force. Well, that's according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics studies. Yet they carry 31% less life insurance than their male counterparts. And women of all ages have smaller average amounts of individual life coverage than men in equivalent age brackets. On average, women have $129,800 of individual life insurance to men's $187,100. In addition, women with high personal incomes, that is $100,000 or more, are less likely to have life insurance than men at the same income level. So what kind of long-term planning exactly do women engage in that is supposedly superior to men? Perhaps it's the skill with which they scope out a man's financial potential, stop taking their contraceptive pills, and get pregnant so that they can be taken care of for the rest of their lives. Well, that's known as premeditated scheming, and that's scarcely a net social positive.
There's other traits that have been studied many times and are based in biology. that are grounded in brain physiology and anatomy and evolved millions of years ago. One is how men and women view power. Women tend to view power as a group of connections. Men tend to view power as rank. Women, it starts in small childhood. Little girls will play in what Deborah Tannen calls flat packs. Then, there's no leader, there's no hierarchy when you're playing dolls or jump rope. These are leaderless groups in which everybody is sensitive to one another's needs. Girls take turns. They offer suggestions. They try to appeal to reason. They try to persuade. And if there's some sort of problem and the girl starts crying, they stop the game. Somebody's feelings are at stake.
Helen, this is becoming sad. Only two types of people in my experience would attempt to portray women as being kind, caring, and sensitive in the manner that Helen is. That first group are people who've had very, very limited experience with women, and the second group is an individual being deliberately disingenuous. If women cared about the feelings of others, why do they initiate 69% of divorces according to Time magazine? What about the feelings of all those children who now get to see their fathers living in the back of the car before he commits suicide? Now again, look, I'm not suggesting women are somehow, evil. No, far from it. But Helen suggests that women are singularly concerned about harmony and ensuring the emotional well-being of other women. The evidence suggests otherwise. A really interesting article titled "Intolerance of Sexy Peers, Intrasexual Competition Among Women" by Tracy Villancourt and Anchal Sharma was published in the journal Aggressive Behavior. The authors found that young women are innately bitchy and behave badly towards other women they perceive as sexy. Instead of physically confronting a rival, however, they will use verbal warfare and petty vendettas. They give their opponents withering glances, incite other women to make bitchy comments behind her back, humiliate and belittle her, spread rumors about her, and suggest they're promiscuous, and try to socially exclude her. And this actual behavior is well known in culture and literature. And the real question is, why does it happen? And it seems this kind of indirect aggression, what we call, bitchiness, may actually have an evolutionary origin. You see, women had to learn ways to compete with other females, to find suitable males with whom to reproduce. And bitchy behavior may actually be hardwired in the female brain. In Valancourt's study, 86 women aged from, between the ages of 20 to 25 were secretly videotaped after being paired with a friend or a stranger and told that they were participating in a study about female friendship. Half of the waiting pairs were interrupted by a plainly dressed assistant in a t-shirt and jeans who had had her hair tied back. The other half were interrupted by the same woman who was now dressed provocatively in a low-cut blouse, short skirt and boots, with her hair loose and flowing. Almost all of the women reacted hostilely to the female dressed in a sexually provocative way. Their bodies stiffened, and they appeared to be angry or uncomfortable. They stared at her up and down, rolled their eyes, or nudged at their companion. When the women left the room, many of them ridiculed her appearance and suggested that she was sexually available. When she dressed conservatively, on the other hand, she was barely acknowledged by the women and prompted no discussion when she left the room. Evolution is about survival. You see, the genes in men and women will have very, very different survival strategies that affect their actions through their emotions. Men and women have evolved differently. There is an assumption that is, of course, in my opinion, incorrect, that the behavior and insecurities of women is received solely via socialization, some form of interaction with their environment. And an example of this logic would be the idea that, the female preoccupation with looking young and attractive is caused by being exposed to other attractive women in the media. And this is a really, really incorrect assumption, and is based on flawed and discredited social science type research that often fails to correct for genetics. Our male and female ancestors have had to face very, very different evolutionary pressures. Women are evolutionarily hardwired to compete with other women for male attention so that they might gain access to his resource. This makes them absolutely self-interested, utterly ruthless, and merciless to sexual competitors. Anybody who has worked in the company of women can attest to this. Also, the behavior of women, where Helen suggests that, they take turns, they appeal to reason, and are leaderless when playing jump rope, is completely at odds with the actual reality of female behavior, specifically adult female behavior. What Helen does, which is actually quite disingenuous, is that she takes the behavior of female toddlers and then extrapolates this into adult females, when nothing could be further from the truth. It's like night and day. By the time a relatively attractive girl is 20 years old, she is, for all intents and purposes, an emotional terrorist and biologically equipped to extract resources from the opposite sex. By this age, she realizes that the sole source of her privileges and power over men is her sex, and she will savagely guard anyone who is attempting to give it away too freely and thereby ruining it for all other women, which is why a British study reported in Time magazine online that women slut-shame each other on Twitter just as much as men do. And the article went on to describe that the fact that cliques and bullying are defining characteristics of the environment created by high school girls, and it's also an outlook that carries on into their adulthood.
And they want to be liked. They live in a world of win-win. Men tend to live in a world of win or lose. As boys, they sort themselves in large hierarchical packs. They interrupt, they give orders, they take orders. Men are much better at giving orders than women, and much better at taking orders than women. Women don't take orders very well. They tease, they barter status.
This idea of win-win and its supposed virtue has been pushed for a while, and I do dare to say it's part of the reason why academia is literally falling apart. The idea that there are no objectively measurable standards, the notion that all ideas are equally valid, and a win-win is somehow always a good thing in its own right. What win-win most often boils down to is compromise. Win-wins tend to be so important to women because it's less about the idea being discussed and more about how it's said. They're obsessed with tone policing, and unless something is said in just the right way so as to not give offense, even the best ideas will not be receptively received by women. If it is somehow, of course, found to be uncomplimentary to women, even more so, even if that idea is objectively true. So just before I proceed here, it's important to know why men typically use win-lose negotiations. And it's very simple, because they work. Because not all ideas are actually created equally, and you as a man need to simply put your feelings aside and admit when you have a substandard product, idea, or solution. You shrug it off and everyone benefits because the best idea carries the day. That's the story of civilizational development. The horse could not compete with the automobile. The city-state could not compete with the nation-state. The militia could not compete against the state-funded army. And slavery could not compete against the tide of industrialization. The ideas and methods whose times were up simply had to be abandoned so that progress could be made. Imagine the attempt to create a win-win situation between those who witnessed the raw power of a steam-powered locomotive and those who wanted to create a win-win scenario by forcing half of the country or half the world to continue using the horse and buggy. Perhaps we ought to face the fact that part of the reason that women do not flourish in STEM or have invented so little of note, or that industries such as medicine, after becoming female-dominated, simply stagnated, is because there are now just far more win-win scenarios. The idea that having 100,000 dermatologists is just as important as having 100,000 pathologists or heart surgeons, or oncologists. After all, win-win means that a doctor is a doctor, and they all deserve equal pay. So then women flood into the comparatively easier parts of the medical professions. Hierarchies exist for a reason, and win-win is not a good thing because everyone wins. As a result, nobody actually improves.
They're emotionally expressive, by and large, much more so than men, and they have what I call diplomatic intelligence. A good example is Oprah Winfrey. This is one quote: "The only time I have ever made a bad decision is when I didn't follow my instincts." Very few men, I think, would say that. An educator, emotionally expressive, really fine verbal skills, etc. A good example of a very high estrogen individual. Bill Clinton, I think, is another high estrogen individual. You know, you can be high on estrogen and testosterone, low on one, low on the other, etc. They're not always necessarily opposed. You know, people have often said, well, you know, when are we going to have our first woman president? I think we've had our first woman president. His book, what's somebody say? Oh, well. I think it's important to have a synthesizing mind. I read that in his book, which was something like 963 pages. Whole world knows he can't stop talking. That's a highly estrogen-related skill. He's the one that cried at their daughter's wedding, not as...
Again, junk science of the highest order. Helen does what many of her ilk have been doing and getting away with now for decades, and that is to suggest that estrogen is a hormone that promotes relatedness, empathy, and calmness. Then why is it that we see in study after study in humans and rodents and fruit flies that increased levels of estrogen are linked to both objectively measured and self-reported levels of aggression in both males and females? An abstract of an article published in 2006 by Kelly Grier, I hope I pronounced that correctly, reads as follows. Estrogen are known as modulators of aggression. However, the specific action of estrogen on brain function has not been determined. In a correlational study, the number of estrogen receptors in regions of the hypothalamus and limbic system were correlated with aggressive behavior in a domestic strain of mice. To determine whether these correlations reflect the effect of estrogen on aggression, the production of estrogen was manipulated by an aromatase inhibitor, and their goal was to observe these subsequent effects on aggressive behavior. And what they actually found, which was very, very interesting, was that a reduction of estrogen production resulted in a decrease in aggressive behavior. So just to explain it to individuals here, an aromatase inhibitor inhibits the production of estrogen. That's why it's used in breast cancer. So you have an aromatase inhibitor given to patients, and they have found that this stops breast cancer progressing. That's the kind of simplified version of this. So if you want to have somebody produce less estrogen, you give them an aromatase inhibitor, and bodybuilders also, for this reason, also use aromatase inhibitors. And another study by Howard Kulin and colleagues in 1997 aimed to determine the role of sex steroids on the development of aggressive behavior in 35 boys and 14 girls. And it's important to note that these studies' participants were actually deficient in their sex hormones to begin with. The findings then indicated the strong effects of self-reported aggressive behaviors when estrogen is taken by adolescent girls, even at very, very low doses of 0.15 milligrams daily, estrogen conjunctive dose. And perhaps you can see why I classify Helen's work as junk science. You see, the estrogen gentleness, testosterone, aggression model of feminist academia neglects the very, very well-known, but perhaps little discussed outside of scientific circles, biochemical process by which the human body readily converts testosterone to estrogen. In fact, this may be one mechanism involved in causing an increase in hormone-dependent aggressive behavior in boys. So when Helen says that the United States has had a female president already, and then points to Bill Clinton, supposedly he's a high estrogen male, of course, she never explained whether they've actually tested this objectively. But the real question is this: why would not Bill Clinton then show the very, very same typically male characteristics of win-lose negotiations, hierarchy, and confidence that she and her ilk despise so much? Because Helen is literally making things up as she goes along, using incomplete science to justify a dogma that female behavior is superior, and this superiority is biologically driven by sex hormones and brain differences, and that any man who is admired by Helen and her feminist ilk must have supposedly female characteristics. After all, only female chemicals could produce such greatness as Bill Clinton, right?
His wife, and everybody knows he feels your pain. He also has got a lot of the traits of high estrogen. You'll see in another slide coming up, but the very round face, the soft face, the lack of of heavy brow ridges is all built, the shorter forehead is all built by estrogen.
Okay, here Helen simply confuses two areas and attempts to bridge them using a false equivalence. The first area of research is related to the evolutionary psychology of physical attractiveness, specifically sexual selection and human morphology, where a myriad of researchers indicated that there are universals in human attractiveness, including, the exaggerating of morphological indicators of youthfulness, such as a small nose, hairless facial skin, prominent high forehead, and small feet. A very good article on this topic is The Evolutionary Psychology of Physical Attractiveness, Sexual Selection and Human Morphology by Nigel Barber. The second area, and the one in which Helen veers dangerously off course, is where she states that these are high estrogen traits, and that is simply not the case. She attempts to suggest that estrogen is the hormone that bears sole responsibility for these morphological and psychological adaptations without actually presenting any evidence to support this. So Helen's thought path is as follows, just to kind of really explain this in very, very simple terms. Human females display very, very specific features and behavioral traits. In this case, it might be a morphological feature such as a high forehead, and specific psychological features which may be the desire to engage in win-win negotiations. Then, without research or evidence backing up her position, she conflates high estrogen with a willingness to enter into win-win negotiation, and then compounds her error by suggesting that any man with a specific morphological look and a specific psychological behavioral pattern must be a high estrogen man. This is known as circular reasoning and is actually quite a serious logical fallacy. And it's here that one notes that the scientific community has a long history of using real science to arrive at nonsensical conclusions and sometimes murderous social policies. An example would be the eugenics movement, which was of course rooted in now discredited beliefs based on biological determinism. This eugenics program led to the forcible sterilization of persons deemed to be unsuitable members of the human species, and later actually partially drove the racist policies of the National Socialists in Germany. Biological determinism, the kind that clearly biases the opinions of academics such as Helen, is not a benign phenomenon. This ideology is used to justify the upholding of a misandric legal system long after the absurdity of its bias has been revealed. They include the belief that men, due to our naturally higher levels of testosterone, that we're unable to control our sex drives and will act on these sex drives to rape at will. This leads to yes means yes laws. Women's higher rates of oxytocin, the incorrectly labeled cuddle hormone, absolutely ensures that men will never ever be given 50-50 access to their kids in the case of a divorce. Biological determinism ensures that only men are subject to the draft. It is driven by a belief that testosterone makes all men enjoy, violence and killing. The recent spate of kill all men hashtags, articles that openly call for the extermination of the male gender, is not because of a desire to shock. It's really based on flawed notions of female genetic superiority, which itself is based on the unsound principles of biological determinism, coupled with an inability of modern academics to correlate their beliefs about gender differences with real-world evidence about behavior and outcomes. For example, if women are naturally, hardwired to be able to spot patterns better and interpret data better, why are they less willing and able to work in professions that reward these specific skills, such as managing hedge funds, financial analysis, or even physics? Helen would likely say that a nefarious conspiracy of men seeks to keep women out of these professions. The truth is, however, far less tinfoil hattish. Firstly, these academics are misrepresenting the supposed impact of neurological differences on abilities of the female sex. And secondly, they fail to go the whole 9 yards in a manner fitting to professional scientists who should, as a matter of course, seek to test their theories in real life. Thank you very, very much. This is CS Mixer.